If we've been to the moon, why is it so hard to go back? Next year marks 56 years since the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969. Since then, only 12 astronauts have walked on the moon during 6 missions, all within a period of less than 3 years. At its peak, the Apollo program employed over 400,000 people from about 20,000 companies and universities. The total cost, adjusted to 2018, was around $145 billion. So after spending so much time, effort, and money, why did our interest in going to the moon suddenly fade? What were the real reasons we stopped going? The dawn of space exploration. The Apollo missions are seen today as a major breakthrough in science and technology. In just a little over 60 years, we went from the Wright brothers' first powered flight to Neil Armstrong's famous steps on the moon. Apollo not only marked the height of the space race, but also became one of the last great human adventures in a century where we had already achieved incredible feats, climbing the highest mountains, exploring the deepest parts of the oceans, and reaching the farthest corners of the Earth. Over time, people's opinions about the Apollo missions have changed. At first, many were unsure if it was worth the cost. For example, in a 1979 NBC poll, only 40% of people said the Apollo program was worth it. But by 1999, 20 years later, that number had increased to 55%. This shows that as time passes, people have come to appreciate the significance of the Apollo missions more and more. In today's world, where many uncertainties surround us, the story of Apollo feels even more special. It reminds us of a time when it seemed like anything was possible. The recent passing of some of the astronauts like Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon, and Gene Cernan, the last man to do so, has only added to the nostalgic view of this era. The political landscape of Apollo. Back when President Kennedy first proposed the idea of sending humans to the moon, it wasn't met with complete enthusiasm. Many scientists were actually against the idea. They believed that the space program would take money away from other important projects. Military leaders were also not in favor, worrying that the best scientists would be pulled away from working on aerospace and missile technology, which was crucial at the time. Community leaders, too, felt that the enormous amount of money required could be better used to address issues like education, poverty, and healthcare. There were many reasons why we eventually stopped going to the moon. The Vietnam War, which escalated between 1968 and 1975, put a strain on the U.S. budget, and there were cuts to the space program as a result. Additionally, as tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union began to ease, the intense competition that fueled the space race started to lose its urgency. People also began to believe that money should be focused more on solving problems here on Earth rather than exploring space. But the two most important reasons for the end of the Apollo missions go back to President Kennedy's speech to Congress in May 1961. At that moment, the United States was under pressure to catch up with the Soviet Union in space exploration, especially after the launch of the first human into space, Yuri Gagarin. Kennedy's call to send a man to the moon was not just about science, it was about proving the strength and capability of the U.S. to the world. Once that goal was achieved with Apollo 11, the political and public drive to continue moon landings quickly faded. The mission to the moon. In November 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected President of the United States at a time when the Soviet Union was achieving remarkable successes in space exploration. The Soviets had taken a strong lead with the spark launch of Sputnik in 1957, the first satellite to orbit the Earth. In 1959, they had orbited the moon and even photographed its far side with their Luna 3 mission. But the biggest achievement came on April 12, 1961, when they sent the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit. This was a huge propaganda victory for the Soviet Union and made it seem to many Americans and others in the West that the U.S. was falling behind in the space race, and perhaps even losing the battle of ideologies between capitalism and communism. Although the U.S. quickly responded by sending Alan Shepard into space just 3 weeks later, Gagarin's mission had already left a deep impression. Kennedy felt pressure to act. On April 20th, 1961, he sent a memo to Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, asking him to investigate which space programs could help the U.S. catch up to and surpass the Soviet Union in space exploration. After consulting with NASA, Johnson came back with 3 possible ideas, all based on expanding the Apollo program. Apollo, initially conceived in 1960 under President Eisenhower, was meant to follow Project Mercury. Unlike Mercury, which only carried 1 astronaut, Apollo was designed to carry 3 astronauts and use much larger rocket stages. These larger rockets, which would eventually evolve into the Saturn V, could even travel as far as the Moon. But at that point, Apollo still didn't have clear goals. Johnson presented 3 options to Kennedy. The first was to build an orbital space station. However, NASA believed that the Soviets, with their lead in heavy rocket technology, would likely achieve this goal first. The second option was to send astronauts on a mission to orbit the Moon. While promising, it was thought that the Soviets might also be able to achieve this, as they had already orbited the Moon with an unmanned probe, Luna 3. The third and boldest option was a manned mission to land on the Moon. NASA believed that the Soviets would have a difficult time pulling this off, and they had shown no signs of attempting it. This option was also far enough in the future that it gave the U.S. a good chance to be the first to achieve it. Initially, Kennedy was unsure about committing to a manned moon landing because of the enormous cost. The estimated price tag was $9 billion over the next 5 years, which, when adjusted for inflation, would be around $70 billion in today's money. Despite the cost, this was the only option that had the kind of prestige and impact Kennedy wanted. A moon landing was big, bold, and would make a powerful statement to the world that America was the leader in space exploration and technology. Ultimately, this was the kind of achievement Kennedy needed to restore American confidence and ensure the U.S. remained a dominant global power. Many people believe that Kennedy was a strong supporter of space exploration, and that this was the reason behind the Apollo program. However, a transcript from an April 1962 meeting between Kennedy and NASA Administrator James Webb, released in 2001, reveals something different. Kennedy admitted he wasn't really interested in space. He only pushed for it because the Soviets were advancing rapidly, especially after Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight a few weeks earlier. Some have also suggested that the Apollo mission was partly to recover from the embarrassment of the failed US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, which had occurred under Kennedy's administration. When Kennedy gave his speech to Congress on May 25, 1961, and said, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the Moon and returning him safely to the Earth," he literally meant just one person. His goal was to have 1 astronaut land on the Moon, plant the U.S. flag, and come back. For Kennedy, Apollo was a political move to achieve a political result. The mission was meant to show the world, especially developing nations still deciding their political futures, that the United States, representing democratic capitalism, was more powerful in technology and organization than the Soviet Union and its communist system. Even though it was a race to beat the Soviets, Kennedy tried twice to share the moon mission with them. Once in a private meeting with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in June of 1961, and again in a United Nations speech in September 1963. The Soviets turned down both offers, and after Kennedy's assassination, the idea was dropped by both countries. It took the Soviets 3 more years to take their moon mission seriously, but by then they had fallen far behind. Technical problems with the N-1 rocket delayed and eventually ended their plans to send people to the moon. Over time, the Apollo program grew from 1 manned landing to 10 missions. After Kennedy's assassination, it became almost a tribute to him. Even after the tragic Apollo 1 accident that killed 3 astronauts during a test, the mission continued to honor Kennedy's vision. This also reminded everyone how risky the mission was. They were flying into the unknown. Although many systems had been tested, and other missions had orbited the moon, developing the lunar lander took longer than expected. The Apollo 11 landing and the ascent from the moon's surface were things that couldn't be fully tested on Earth. If something went wrong, the astronauts could be stranded on the moon. This made Apollo 11 the grand finale of the space race between the US and the Soviets, with tense moments right until the end. The Soviets tried to steal some of Apollo's spotlight by landing a remote-controlled lunar rover on the moon in February 1969, but the rocket failed at launch, and this was kept secret for years. The replacement rover finally landed in February 1970, but by then, Apollo 11 had already reached the moon. The crew landed, planted the US flag, and stayed for 21 hours and 36 minutes before safely returning home. With that, the race was over. The US had won. They had landed men on the moon and brought them back safely, just as Kennedy promised in 1961. While there were 9 more Apollo missions planned, Apollo 11 was the main goal. The rest of the missions were focused on science and making full use of the huge investment that got Apollo 11 to the moon. The Apollo program, though a monumental achievement, was primarily driven by political motives rather than scientific or long-term exploration goals. It was a project meant to demonstrate the power of the United States and the superiority of the free market system during the Cold War. However, after the initial success of landing humans on the moon, there was no clear plan for the future. There were no ambitions to continue the exploration, build a permanent base on the moon, or even return for more missions. The conclusion of Apollo was vague and without direction, a point that was raised by some at the time. Yet, despite these concerns, the higher-ups in the government didn't take significant action to address the lack of a long-term strategy. Once the excitement from Apollo 11 began to fade, public interest dwindled. What was once a moment of global celebration slowly became less significant to many. People began to adopt a been there, done that attitude. The missions that followed, while impressive, didn't captivate the public's imagination in the same way. This shift in public opinion was reflected in the media. What was once front-page news worldwide now barely made headlines. In some countries, later Apollo missions weren't even reported. As interest from both the public and the government declined, NASA found itself facing budget cuts. By January 1970, after the Apollo 12 mission, NASA announced that it would reduce its workforce by 50,000 jobs. This was a significant cut, as NASA had already been shrinking from its peak of 400,000 employees in the 1960s to 190,000 by 1970. The pressure to reduce costs led to the cancellation of Apollo 20. Its Saturn V rocket was instead repurposed to launch Skylab, a space station made from the upper stages of the same rocket. Among the remaining Apollo missions, Apollo 13 stands out, but not for the reasons NASA hoped. The mission is famous not for new discoveries or milestones, but for the near-disastrous events that unfolded, leading to a dramatic rescue mission. This incident brought the excitement and drama back into the space program as people watched anxiously to see if the astronauts would return safely. However, the aftermath of Apollo 13 sparked discussions about ending the program altogether. NASA, unwilling to let the program conclude on a failure, made the decision to cancel Apollo missions 18 and 19 and combine their objectives into Apollo 17. This final mission would become the last time humans traveled to the moon. With the end of Apollo, NASA was left in an uncertain position. Skylab, though innovative, was a temporary solution, a space station built from leftover Saturn V parts. The space shuttle, originally part of a larger plan for returning to the moon and even traveling to Mars, was now repurposed for missions limited to low Earth orbit. The shuttle program, while practical, didn't carry the same sense of wonder or exploration as Apollo. Its missions were primarily focused on transporting astronauts and equipment to and from orbit, essentially becoming a space truck. This shift meant that humanity's giant leap would now be restricted to a few hundred miles above the Earth. With no further plans for deep space exploration, the need for the massive Saturn V rockets and the infrastructure to support them faded away. The dream of returning to the moon or going beyond was put on hold indefinitely. After the Apollo, should we have stopped going to the moon? Or would it have been better to keep exploring? Maybe working with countries like the Soviet Union, like we did when we built the International Space Station together? Let me know what you think in the comments.